Howdy readers, I'm Jason. This is Chapter and Verse, and tonight I come to you unexpectedly with a tag. So this is the top 10 nonfiction books tag, which was created just the other day by my good friend Lukas over at Totally Pretentious. The point of the tag is self-explanatory, as Lukas said, I think in the show notes below his video. Your top 10 nonfiction books. He wants us to rank them from 10 to 1, if possible. And he had two requests. One was to not include poetry, which is fine. The other was to not include religious books. Now, by that, I think Lukas meant to not include canonical religious texts, right? So the Bible or the Quran or the Torah, what have you. Because he himself included what I consider to be religious books in his version of the tag, the Karen Armstrong book, the Marilyn Robinson book. So I'm going to abide by his poetry rule and abide by what I actually think he meant by his disqualification of religious books rule. So how I went about this was, so I looked at my Goodreads ratings and I sorted them from 5-star to 1-star, and I just looked through all of my 5-star ratings of nonfiction books, and I chose my top 10 from among those, which meant that there were some 4-star nonfiction books that didn't make the cut, but which really could have made the cut. But I decided to just arbitrarily go with 5-star books on Goodreads. So without further ado, my number 10 book is Iron John, a book about men by Robert Bly. And I ranked this number 10 because I haven't read it since I was an undergraduate. And the book was so important to me in college. Now, it would behoove you to know that when I was in college, I was very outdoorsy, and I was a very good fisherman. And as I've gotten older, I have become less tolerant of heat and insects and sleeping in a sleeping bag. So, yeah, I haven't been camping in a very, very, very long time. I haven't been fishing in a very, very long time. But back then, this book, which is essentially Robert Bly interpreting the fairy tale Iron Hans, right? And he renames it Iron John, just because John is the familiar name, is the common name that Hans was once upon a time. And his interpretations of it were so powerful for me. Just the ways in which he explored archetypes. Funny story, so when this was published, the poet Sharon Dubiago reviewed it in some venue or other, I can't remember where it was, and just gave it a scathing review, just a scathing review. Well, when I was in college, I had Sharon Dubiago as a professor one semester, and I'll have to tell you the full story of that another time. Suffice it to say that I was allowed out of the class after the drop date and permitted to finish that poetry course as an independent study with Allison Hagee because of the confrontation that happened between Sharon Dubiago and myself. And anyway, and then so later, a year and a half later, whatever it was, when I had the chance to meet Robert Bly, he came to Cheyenne and gave a reading at Laramie County Community College. When I went up and got my book signed by him, I mentioned that I had had her as a professor, and Bly said, "Oh, she's a very vicious woman," which I'll never forget. And then later that night, my friend Christian and I got to tag along when Bly and a bunch of the instructors from the college went out for drinks. And we got to tag along because the guy who orchestrated it all, Chuck Thompson, who was the head of the humanities department, and I were good friends. Some of the English instructors, I could tell, were nonplussed to have two undergraduates tagging along, but I had connections, so I don't know what I would make of it now. I should maybe reread it this year, I don't know. But it was incredibly important to me when I was a young man, and I suspect it still would be. So it's my number 10, Iron John, Robert Bly. My number 9 book is Mystery and Manners, Occasional Prose by Flannery O'Connor. And this is a selection of essays that O'Connor wrote and maybe articles as well, addresses that she had given. The individual pieces in here are remarkable. But my favorite thing about this book, if I ever get another tattoo, if Kelly will ever let me get another tattoo, which is debatable, and that's putting it nicely, I will get this quote tattooed on my left forearm. And I just love it. I mean, this is a big part of my philosophy in a nutshell. So. And this is from her piece called Catholic Novelists in this book. She wrote, "Art never responds to the wish to make it democratic. It is not for everybody. It is only for those who are willing to undergo the effort needed to understand it." All right, I'll read that one more time. "Art never responds to the wish to make it democratic. It is not for everybody. It is only for those who are willing to undergo the effort needed to understand it." Right? I mean, that is a stunning mind at work. When I think about the fact that Flannery O'Connor died, she died at the age of 39. I was going to say in her late 30s. At the age of 39, right? She was 5 years younger than I am right now when she died. That's just astonishing. So, Flannery O'Connor, Mystery and Manners, number 9. Number 8 is Ecology of Fear, Los Angeles and the Imagination of Disaster by Mike Davis. Now, this is a book that I read in graduate school for a class called The Elemental West, and we read nonfiction and fiction that dealt with the American West, and not just the rural kind of aspects of it, but as you can tell, right, the cityscapes as well. In that class, we read a book about surfing called Caught Inside. We read a Craig Childs book. We read Angle of Repose by Wallace Stegner. We read some Terry Tempest Williams. And we read this. And this book knocked me out. I would find out later that Mike Davis is a socialist, so maybe that's part of it. Since that's where my own kind of political identity leans. But yeah, this is, 400, roughly 400 pages of why you should never live in Los Angeles. And it makes a very compelling case. One of the things I love so much about what he does in this is he takes natural disasters, whether they're fires or earthquakes, and he anthropomorphizes them in a way that makes it feel very visceral and personal and immediate. And it's just incredibly gripping. On almost every page in this book, I was just astounded by something. I couldn't stop talking about it when I read it. And I think it speaks as well just to my own fascination with apocalypse, with apocalyptic events and disasters. Maybe this comes from the fact that I live 2 hours away from the epicenter of maybe the biggest volcano in the world, Yellowstone National Park. That's what's going to happen in Wyoming one day. Someday, at some point down the road, Yellowstone is going to blow. And if it happens in my lifetime, Kelly's lifetime, we will be lucky because we'll be so close to it. It'll be over for us very soon. The rest of you who live much further afield will suffer much more so than we will. I'm also really fascinated by the Cascadia Fault Line off of the coast of the Pacific Northwest, up in the Seattle area, and what's going to happen there probably in the next 100 years. There was a piece that was done in the New York, not the New York Times, the New Yorker, a couple of years ago that was just such a brilliant piece of investigative journalism. I mean, it's a really long article, and I read that whole article oh God, probably 2 or 3 times in the first couple of days I knew about it, and I've read it since then. I've read it probably another 2 or 3 times. It's absolutely marvelous. I will try to link to it in the description box below. But yeah, Ecology of Fear. If you are at all of an apocalyptic mindset or bent, this is a book you need to read. And if you live in Los Angeles or have thought about moving to Los Angeles, read it and yeah, and throw a dart at a map and find a different place to live. So, Ecology of Fear, that's number 8. Number 7 is a book that I've talked about on my channel before. This is probably my favorite memoir, and this is Girl Meets God by Lauren Winner. So I won't say too much about it because, again, I've talked about it before. But this is a memoir of Lauren Winner's conversion from Judaism to Christianity when she was in college. She is now an Episcopal priest, if memory serves. She's also a professor at Duke, I think. I think it's at Duke. And she has more university degrees than I have fingers and toes, it seems like. But this is such a fine memoir, such a fine study of identity and fate and progress, right? Spiritual progress. Yeah, this is a wonderful book. Girl Meets God, number 7. Number 6 is a book that I have not talked about on my channel before. And this is Letters to a Young Poet by Rainer Maria Rilke. So once upon a time, there was a young poet, and this poet wrote the much more famous, well-known poet, established poet, Rilke, for advice. And this is Rilke's side of their correspondence. And I read this many times as an undergrad. And I was a very serious poet back then. And I'm not anymore. I don't really write poetry anymore. And part of me thinks it might actually be because of this book. So Rilke, at one point, in a letter that he wrote to this young poet, Rilke essentially said that you should write poetry only if it would kill you to not write poetry. If you would die, if some part of you, some substantial part of you would die, if it were denied you the ability or the opportunity to write poetry, that's when you should write poetry. That's when you're a poet. And if that's not true of you, then, he suggests, I don't know that he explicitly goes on to say, but you should find something else to do. And I think at some point along the line, even though I was a decent poet, I realized that. And my life doesn't feel any worse for wear. It doesn't feel diminished in any way because I don't write poetry anymore. But it's just a marvelous, wise, very slim book, and if you haven't read it before, you should. All right, let's see here. I'm running out of room. That was number 6. Number 5 is by the Catholic novelist Ron Hansen, and this is A Stay Against Confusion: Essays on Faith and Fiction. So I think this is Ron Hansen's only work of nonfiction. And it is an absolutely marvelous book. I have taught some of the essays in here before. His piece called Faith and Fiction is wonderful. What stories are and why we read them is absolutely brilliant. It's an incredibly thought-provoking piece, especially for readers who are just starting to explore serious fiction for the first time. And then, what is it? Yeah, so one of the last essays in the book, Hearing the Cry of the Poor, the Jesuit Martyrs of El Salvador. That is necessary reading. Yeah, so I would highly recommend seeking this out if you are at all interested in the intersection of religious faith and art. All right, so that was number 5. Number 4 is The Uses of Enchantment, The Meaning and Importance of Fairy Tales by Bruno Bettelheim. So as I understand it, this is a book that has fallen slightly out of favor. It is maybe considered to be not passé per se. That's kind of a funny construction. But not as relevant, I suppose, or not as psychologically astute as maybe it was once considered. But I love it. I just think it's profound and mysterious and provocative, I suppose would be a really good word for it as well. But yeah, if you're at all interested in fairy tales and the iconography of fairy tales and how fairy tales exhume what is deep in our psyches and deep in our hearts, and stick it out in the sunlight and poke it with sticks. This is a book for you. It's a marvelous book, even if it has fallen slightly out of fashion. All right, so we're down to the top 3 now. Number 3 is Ghost Hunters, William James and the Search for Scientific Proof of Life After Death by Deborah Blum. And I know many of you are probably scoffing a little bit at this. I think I'm probably in the minority as someone who believes in spirits and ghosts and what have you. But this book is astonishing. Deborah Blum is a Pulitzer Prize winner for science writing. She teaches at the University of Wisconsin, or at least she did until recently. I think she's still there. And this book tells the story of William James, who was the father of modern psychology. I think he wrote the first psychology textbook, really. He was teaching, I think, at Harvard at the time. He is from that James family, right? The Henry James family. And this book is, right, I'm going to curse, I'm sorry, but it's fucking convincing. So William James put together a crew of thinkers, of intellectuals, and including Alfred Russel Wallace. Who else was on board with him? And what they did was, there in the 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, they sought to seriously investigate spiritualists and mediums. These were people who were being mocked and scoffed by the scientific establishment, and deservedly so in many cases. But that was the thing, right? So nobody who was mocking and scoffing was seriously looking at these people and at these phenomena. William James and his team thought that they at least warranted serious investigation, and so that's what they did. And they proved 96% of these people to be hucksters, to be frauds. But for 5% of them, they couldn't disprove what they were doing. And beyond that, beyond sort of proof and disproof, in the sense that we think of sort of magic tricks, there were a couple of people who they investigated, one in particular named Leonora Piper, that they believed in. They believed were absolutely legitimate. And I can't imagine somebody reading this book and thinking otherwise. So a lot more to say about this book, but this video is already longer than I planned it to be. So if you're at all curious, you should read it. And if you are curious to talk to me more about it, go ahead and message me on Voxer. My handle is OldBlueCV. All right, number 2, again, is a book I've talked about on this channel, and that is My Bright Abyss, Meditation of a Modern Believer by Christian Wiman. This is part memoir. This is part theological discussion. This is part study, I suppose, of illness. Wiman has a very rare cancer. I believe it's a blood cancer, a bone cancer, and it's in his bone marrow. And this book is like a lightning strike of brilliance, right? So when you read Marilyn Robinson's nonfiction, for instance, The Death of Adam, or when I was a child I read books, you get a sense of an intellect that is towering, right? Absolutely towering. Christian Wiman is a religious mind on par with Marilyn Robinson. So if you're a fan of hers, you need to be reading him. And if you're not, the sooner you do, you'll thank me for putting this on your radar. My Bright Abyss, Christian Wiman. Something on almost every page in this book that is just literally mind-blowing. And then the last book, my number one nonfiction book, is The Snow Leopard by Peter Matthiessen, which I have still only read once. It was when I was an undergraduate in a class I was taking on Buddhism. And it just shook me so much and moved me so much. And, you know, I had never read a work of nature writing, or any work for that matter, that had done a better job up to that point in my life of kind of presenting the natural world to me, and why one could sense that it was sacred just through one's powers of observation. This is a hell of a book. Brian from Bookish, I think it was last year, read this and really loved it as well. I haven't reread it since my undergraduate days, but I plan to before too terribly long. Not just to see, you know, how it stacks up now, how it reads to me, you know, in my mid-40s compared with how it read to me in my 20s. But I just remember taking such comfort and such solace from this book and from how Matthiesen's mind worked. And I don't know, in the world that we live in today, I feel like comfort and solace are in short supply, and it would maybe do me good to reread this here soon. So, The Snow Leopard, that's my number one. And that's it. So as far as tagging people goes, I would like to tag Mark Nash, who I am doing a buddy read with right now, along with Kelly, who's upstairs watching Mockingjay Part 2 at the moment. And Valentina Garcia, who hasn't made a video in a very, very long time. And this is my attempt to kind of lure her back into the BookTube fray as far as stepping in front of the camera goes. So Mark Nash, Valentina Garcia, consider yourselves tagged, and I will talk to you guys again very soon. Adios.